Please take your Bibles with me this morning and turn in them to Exodus chapter 20. That's page 61 if you're using one of the Pew Bibles. And if you would stand with me for this morning's reading. I'll be reading verses 1 through 6 from the ESV Bible. Exodus 20, 1 to 6. Please follow along with me as I read. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. May the Lord add His blessing this morning to the reading of His word. You may be seated. I want to speak at the outset of this morning's study that to a degree, this morning's study is going to leave you hanging. You'll likely experience a degree of disappointment at the end of the message. I want to prepare you at the outset for that. This is going to be a two-part study on the second commandment. As far as I can tell in the Hebrew, this commandment has the most Hebrew words than any of the 10, and I think in that way it's appropriate to give it a couple messages at least. So prepare for that. I don't want you to be disappointed at the end. I'd rather have you be disappointed at the beginning. I want to start by explaining what I believe to be the logical coherence of the second commandment in its following the first. First is, you shall have no other gods before me. The second is, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, and it goes on. It's interesting to note that the Lutherans and Catholics, in their rendition of the 10, combine the first two commandments that I just shared with you, and that together is their first commandment. You shall have no gods before me, and that includes not carving images. It's part of the first. And then they take the 10th, what we call the 10th, on coveting, and they turn that into two commands. That's how they interpret it, understand it. The reason I point that out is not just by way of information, but to say that that doesn't come out of nowhere. They do that for a reason. It makes a degree of sense as to why they combine what we call the first two commandments and they make them one. Now, I don't agree with that breakup of the 10, but there's a reason they do it. There's a reason for this perspective. It's not without warrant. The reason they come to this conclusion is because there is an overlapping of the two. Now, people from our perspective, breaking the 10 the way we do, or at least I think you do, is we try to make it a little bit tidy and clean in the way that we separate the two. And some folks say, well, there's really not overlap between the first and the second. They're two different things. The first has to do with having no other gods with God, in the presence of God, no other gods before Him, or Him alone as God. That's what the first commandment's about. And then the second commandment is about how you worship that sole God. You need to worship Him appropriately, because one of the things we'll get into is that Israel worshiped God, the God, through the means of idols. And we'll talk about that as we get into the message this morning. So there was a way in the ancient mind, and we'll find it's not only the ancient mind, but ours as well, to worship God with the assistance of idols. You say, who's doing that? Well, probably you and me to a degree. We'll talk about that. But that's the way that some commentators like to separate the two. The one has to do with God being the only God. The second has to do with how you worship that God. But it's not that simple. There is, I believe, overlap, and that's what leads the Lutherans and Catholics to divide the commandments the way they do and combine these first two. What does this second commandment have to do with? Well, I think it has to do with two things. The first part of the command, or at least a part of the command, not necessarily in any order, has to do with not carving images, idols, like the other nations do. The other nations worship idols. They're not embodied, but pictured as this carven image, graven image, and they worship a false god through the form of idolatry. And God's saying, don't worship false gods, which includes idolatry in the current day. Don't do that. Don't worship false gods. That's the overlap. Because He's already said don't have any gods, so why should He say don't worship false gods? He just said that in the first one. Well, I'll get to that. And then the second part of the command is, and don't bring idolatry into my system. Don't use idols along with me, even idols that are connected to me. So there's two things going on here. Don't worship the false gods like the other nations do. And don't bring the means of idolatry into worshiping me. It may be confusing, but I hope by journey's end it won't be. It'll be very clear and you'll understand it very well. But let's talk about the overlap. Why? Why is there overlap? He said, have no other gods before me, and then he says kind of again, and don't have idols of other gods. You'd think the first commandment would get rid of that other part. Well, there's a sense in which if the first commandment was completely alone, you wouldn't need the other 9. So there's overlap between them all. When God is God, all the other 9 should be taken care of. And yet there are 9 others. So we'll see overlap. We see it right from the very beginning. But why? What is the logical coherence between the first and the second? Well, here's what I think is happening here. The first, as we talked about last week, no gods before me, takes place in the theoretical, conceptual, theological, philosophical, mind, heart. What do all those things have to do with? If you could classify all of them, you'd put them in the category of unseen, internal. Let me say them again. Theoretical, conceptual, theological, philosophical, mind, heart. All of those things take place on the outside or the inside of a person. Come on, guys, let's do this. Let's do this together here, okay? The second word, or the second command, starts moving from the outside, the inside to the outside. The second word, or the second command, has to do with practical, experiential, physical, external, observable things, like idols. You're carving them, you're casting it, whether with wood or with metal, and you're making it, you're adorning it, you're painting it. These are said to be very beautiful objects of art. But what's happening is there's an internal thing that's beginning to make its way to the outside in the form of observable things, observable practices. Your body is now bowing. You're actually serving. You're doing things on the outside. The first all happened on the inside, in the mind and the heart. We'll find that the third one even gets a little bit more external, and it has to do with saying God's name in vain. But what's saying? Saying is what I'm doing right now. What am I doing right now? I'm talking, and guess what? You're all hearing it. It's getting more broadcast, as it were. So it's starting on the inside. It's working its way out to the formation of something, the serving of something outside of me. And now I'm broadcasting it with my tongue, my mouth, my vocal cords. And then it gets into the calendar, the Sabbath. So it's now, getting broad. This is the week that everybody obeys. But then the last 6 commands, what do they have to do with? My treatment of you. It's all outside of me. It all has to do with other people, other things. So my point is you'll have overlap, but there's a trajectory of God here. There's a movement of God that starts on the inside and works its way out. And then as we talked about, even though it has to do with other people, the coveting still has to do with the inside. So it's bookended with the internals, even though it's looking outside with coveting. So there's a movement from the inside to the out. It's very much the same way what you see with Jesus in Matthew and Luke with the Beatitudes. What's the first beatitude? Blessed are the poor in spirit. The last beatitude is, blessed are you when you are reviled for my name. What's that have to do? Well, that has to do with the most external thing imaginable, how other people treat you. So it starts on the inside, Jesus does, in Matthew and Luke, and then he goes to the outside with persecution. So he has a similar trajectory of moving from the in to the out. I think what this overlap is between the two is that God is seeking to be incredibly thorough. Let me put it to you this way. It's very possible for you to finish last week's message on having no gods before God, and you leaving last week and feeling like, yeah, pretty much, that's where I'm at, I don't think there's any other gods. I'm not a polytheist. I'm not a pantheist. I don't look at the trees and the wind and think they're God. There's only one God. I'm a monotheist. Yeah, I got that one covered. Okay, on to the next one. And then you get to the next one where he starts talking about the external movement of the first one, and all of a sudden we find ourselves to be theoretical theists and practical idolaters, which negates us being a theist. And you're like, you're getting so weird and confusing, and I don't understand how this all works together. How could you be believing that God is the only God while simultaneously being an idolater? The reason I can say that dogmatically is because that was essentially a summation of Israel's history. It's what they did repeatedly. You find Israel's prophets repeatedly condemning Israel for its idolatry, while simultaneously saying, so stop worshiping. You don't really mean what you're doing. This proves it all over here, but you're still doing all the stuff. So just quit. Get this right here in your brain and stop the worshiping part, because it's a fraud. It's fake. It's fraudulent. It's not for real. You worship me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. I don't attend your feasts anymore. You're so good about bringing your sacrifices, but I don't receive a single one. I don't want it. The blood of goats is not for me. I don't want it. I don't need it. I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I'm not showing up at your praise services. Why? Because the theoretical that you think you got so right is proven wrong by the practical, which is idolatry. You boast theological precision, all the while you are courting idols. They undercut the commitment which you claim in your head. So, the reason I can say that the second is necessary is because it's a perfect complement to the first. It puts its finger on the nerve that Israel didn't know they had. They agree wholeheartedly to the first. They do it repeatedly. Yeah, you're the God. You're the God. Then why is it, Israel, that when I bring you into the promised land, you claim the territory, that Joshua, before he dies, has to say to you, now, if you claim that God is God, then you need to get rid of your foreign idols. What? You mean all the while Israel was conquering the promised land, they had idols with them? Answer, yes. True story. So, what is going on here? Well, let's talk a little bit more with precision about one command, two evils. Try to explain the logical coherence. One is moving from the internal to the external. Then we're talking about one command, but there's two evils going on in this command. Or I could say it this way, there's two ways to break this command. At least two ways to break this command. The first one is very easy to define, much easier than the second way to break it. But the first one is really easy. We see it right from the get-go in Exodus 32. That's the second way to break it. But let's go first to Numbers 25. Numbers 25 is the way to break this commandment in the first way, which is Israel comes up along the border of Moab on the way to the promised land, and there's worship taking place on the border. They're worshiping Baal. We would say Baal. He's a false god. And Israel gets caught up with that worship. They start participating in the worship of an idol. It's expressed idolatry. He's not a god, and they're worshiping him. He's not connected with God in any way, and they're worshiping this false god. That's very easy. It's very hedonistic in a sense. It's completely separated from God and the type of idolatry that comes into our minds when we think of idolatry, where someone has a false god on their shelf, a Buddha, whoever, and they bow down to it, they worship it. That's a false god. That's idolatry. That's what most of us think of as idolatry, and it is, but it's not exclusively idolatry. There's another form of idolatry which Israel was very much caught up in. It's much more subtle. It's more difficult to define. But this is the one that we see take place actually before the Baal worship in Numbers 25. This, I'd call it religious idolatry. The first is, riotous idolatry, rank idolatry. This is the more subtle form, and it's the religious idolatry that takes place in Exodus 32. Moses is on the mountaintop with God. He's taking way too long as far as Israel sees it. And so they get impatient. And they take off all their gold, and they put it in the fire, and Aaron says, "Behold, out came this calf." We know that the calf was very much a part of Egyptian idolatry, but what probably is taking place here is not just that they're worshiping this calf as a god, even though it will get called God. What they probably mean is that this is an image that connects us to God, whether He's behind it or on top of it or along with it, or it's just an image of His power and His strength. We still really mean for it to be connected to the true God that just liberated us out of Egypt. So they're using a secular means of idolatry to assist them in their actual worship. That's what's taking place here. Now, it still might be hard to understand. So let me give you one additional example. 2 Kings, we learn of the northern tribe king Jehu, and he's a very fascinating character. The reason he's so fascinating is because as he takes the throne, He has a passion to eradicate the worship of Baal. And so he's a very interesting guy, and here's how he does it. The first thing he does is he kills Queen Jezebel, who was incredibly intertwined with Baal worship. A wicked, wicked person. She dies. That's good for Israel. But he goes further. He says, hey, this is what I want you guys to do. I want you to go out and I want you to gather all the Baal priests and all the faithful Baal worshipers. And I want you to tell them that I am going to give a great, great sacrifice to Baal. And I want you to gather everybody, far and wide, whoever worships Baal, I want to gather with them and offer this great sacrifice. Ahab worshipped Baal a little bit. I'm going to worship him a lot. So they say, you got it. So they go and they get all the priests, they get all the worshipers, they get all the loyalists to Baal, and they gather together in the house of Baal. And he says, okay, now I want you to go through the house, now that everybody's gathered, and I want you to make sure that there's no one there that worships Yahweh. And I say, okay. So they go through and they test everybody's allegiance. Yeah, we're pure Baalists, okay? They say, okay, that's what the king wants to know. And then he says to his men, if you let a single person out of this house alive, you'll die. And they completely slaughter every Baal priest and every Baal worshiper. Then they burn the pillar to Baal. Then they destroy the actual worship center of Baal. Just raze it. It's gone. And this is what 2 Kings 10, 28, 29, how they summarize the leadership of King Jehu. Thus, Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel. But Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. That is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and Dan. See, a little Israelite history is that when the tribes of Israel separated, Judah, the southern tribe, had the worship center of Israel. That was where Jerusalem was. This is where they were to go 3 times a year and worship. It was a long journey. It was a dangerous journey for people to take, but they were commanded to go there 3 times a year to celebrate feasts to the Lord. Well, when Jeroboam became king and the tribes were separate, Jeroboam said, hey, listen, I'm kind of uneasy with all my people going to the tribe of Judah where there's another king. I really want to keep my tribes to be my tribes. So listen, people, I'm going to make it really easy for you. You don't have to go to Jerusalem. You don't have to go to celebrate and take this long, dangerous, costly journey for you and your family. What we're going to do in the northern tribes is I'm going to erect 2 golden calves. They are going to be our place of worship to God. You see, idols don't die easy, right? So he keeps the same imagery from Exodus 32, and he carries it on to assist them in their worship of God. These are the two manifestations of idolatry in Israel. One was very easy to define. It was Baal. And Jehu eradicated that. It's gone. The other one the Bible condemns Jehu for is the much more subtle one, which still includes Yahweh, but it's worshiping Yahweh through the means of idolatry. You've got rank idolatry and you've got religious idolatry. That is what's going on here in this commandment. So, we come to this and we say, what is happening? That is Israel, Old Testament Israel, but that's not us. I mean, thanks for the history lesson, but this really isn't happening in our day. We've got things pretty well squared away. So what about us? let's consider our crime. Let me ask you some hopefully humbling question if you're being the arrogant person that I'm assuming you are. Should we think ourselves immune to something that plagued Israel for its entire history? No, we should not. Is it arrogant to think that we could easily dodge a sin that was so subtle that it was readily practiced in the Israelite community for centuries? Could there not be some form of idolatry present right here in our religious assembly or in the churches across America? Should we not be humbled when we observe that this command was a test, a way to analyze and assess and judge both the northern tribe and the southern tribe kings for Israel's entire history? If you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, you find that every king is judged according to his handling of idolatry. So, is God not now looking at us and judging us according to our handling of idolatry? I mean, should we be so stupid to think that God is not practicing with current people the same way He did with ancient people who were just like us? Is it possible that this commandment, and it's having more words than any of the other commandments, may speak to its profound influence on us? Notice the all-encompassing nature of the command. You shall not carve any images of any likeness that is in heaven above, or earth beneath, or the water that is under the earth. It's as if God is saying, like the song, "Come thou fount of every blessing, Lord, help my heart. It is so" what? Prone to wander. That God has to point out every realm of the universe to say, now be careful about all three realms. Calvin, it was, who said that we are, our hearts, idol factories, always ready to concoct a next idol. So, I want to talk about us. I want to talk about our crime of idolatry. And I want to talk about the specific crime of idolatry. What is so bad about idolatry? We're going to spend a ton of time on this next week. But what is so bad about idolatry is this: that it is unloving. Idolatry is the worst form of unlove. We were created, our purpose was created to image forth God. And as a result of us chasing anything else, we begin to image forth that. And that, whatever it is, whoever it is, doesn't have life. Therefore, when we begin to image forth that which we worship, we suffocate everyone around us. This is why Jesus says, you go to the ends of the earth to make disciples, and you make them twice the sons of hell as you. Because you're chasing something that's not me. So when you go to present what you think to be me, but it's really not me, you're teaching other people to be not like me. You're killing them. You're making them sons of hell just like you. And worse, actually. You see, we were made to image forth God, who is life. And so when we don't image forth life, all we can be imaging forth is what? What's the opposite of life? Death. This is why when Pastor Alex taught through the letter of Galatians and Peter is sticking to the old forms of Judaism, which Christ has fulfilled and met in its realization, but Peter's still, hesitant and he's sticking to those forms. Paul rebukes him publicly and says, "What are you doing? That way does not go to life. It's an old system that ended in Christ, and you're claiming that the old system in your behavior is still the deal. It's no longer the deal. The deal has arrived. Jesus is here." All of that stuff was meant to escort us to Him, and when we get to Him, all that stuff drops, unless it's embodied in Him somehow, some way, which nearly all of it's fulfilled in Him. He still has morality, of course, but the regulations, the rituals, these sorts of things, they were just pointers. They were just images, shadows of Him. He's the substance. So let those go. But Peter, you're still sticking to those, which is leading all these other people to think that the life is still there, but it's not there anymore. The life's over here. So I need to rebuke you publicly. And Peter takes it because he started pitching his tent back with the religious acceptabilities of the day. And Jesus isn't the religious acceptability of the day. Jesus is Jesus. So the greatest crime of idolatry is unlove. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that idolatry is actually being a total coward. You know why? Because you're looking to something else to do your job. Because guess what you are? You're the only acceptable image of God. You're actually created to be His image. And you're chasing something else as though it's the image. And dads, you can be leading your families to do this. Saying, this is the goal, kids. This is the ideal. And it's not God. So the greatest crime of idolatry is it distorts our purpose. It's unloving because we were created to image forth God. If you image forth anything else, you will suffocate the life around you. I hesitate to tell you this, but I continue. I worked at Little Caesars Pizza in high school. And one of the dumb things we did there is we let off the fire extinguisher. And we thought it was going to be the ice form, but it wasn't. It was the dust form. I didn't really know what that did until we did it. And we hit, I say we, I think it was me. I can't remember fully. That's right. I appreciate you, Gary. Not often, but I really do right now. So we hit it, and this cloud of dust just boom. And we're kind of like, first thought was, that's weird. Second thought was, this is what it's like to be on Mars because I can't suck any air in right now. It's the scariest feeling, among the scariest feelings I've ever felt. It was like it just steals the oxygen out of the room. We drop down to the ground to breathe. It was really frightening. And that's what it's like when another God is present in the room. It will kill the people around you. It will threaten the life in the room. This is why Paul will say, listen, whenever you speak, seek to speak as though you're speaking the very words of God, fit for the occasion. Because if you speak anything else, you're suffocating the people around you. Paul will go on to say, I venture to speak of nothing else except what Christ has accomplished through me. Why? Because that breathes life into the room. People can inhale. In the command here, he talks about iniquity, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the third and fourth generation. The word there, Philip Ryken notes, is something that refers to, that's something that's twisted. It's contorted. It's not the way it's meant to be. Sin contorts. It twists. It perverts. It makes something that's supposed to look like this instead. And it's not the true image of what it's meant to appear as. It's what sin does. It twists the face of God. We no longer look like the image of God when we're chasing something that's not, in fact, God. This is why in Exodus 32, when Israel concocts this golden calf, God says to Moses, give me a second. I'm going to go obliterate them and make a kingdom out of you. Why? Because this kingdom that was meant to be a kingdom of priests who look like God to the nations no longer looks like me. So they need to die. Why? Not just because I need my name vindicated. I don't need a vindicated name. The world needs a vindicated name of God, not me. I'm fine and dandy as I am. Self-sufficient. I don't need anything. Nothing can be added to me to give me more glory, more weight. I don't need it. I'm completely fine. But the world, this lost world that I love, needs an accurate image of me. And these people, they're not it anymore. They're whoring after gods. And it says they rose up to play, which means get involved in a lot of bad activity. They don't look like me anymore. They look like the world. So I'm going to obliterate them. In fact, you know what he calls them? This is a fascinating term. What have they just erected? A golden calf. So you know what they're called? They are a stiff-necked people. What's that mean? They are becoming like that which they worship. Do you see? The golden calf, ding, 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 knock on its neck. It's hard, it's stiff, doesn't move. And he's saying they're becoming what they worship. And this is all through the Bible. I've preached a whole sermon on this. 2 Kings 17, it says they went, this is a summary of Israel, northern tribes of Israel's behavior. They went after false idols and became what? False. They went after a lie and they became a lie. Do you see? They went after a false image and they became a false image to the world when I created them to be my image. In other words, they are no longer valuable to anyone. But you say, stop. God has given them leaders to keep them in the image of God. That's why he raises up shepherds to keep the people in the image of God, priests and kings and the like, right? No, they would surely curb it. Jeremiah 23, thus says the Lord of hosts, do not listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you, filling you with vain hopes. They speak visions of their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They say continually to those who despise, who ignore the word of the Lord, it shall be well with you. And to everyone who stubbornly follows his own heart, they say, no disaster shall come upon you. For who among them has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see and to hear his word? Or who has paid attention to his word and listened? Behold, the storm of the Lord, wrath has gone forth, a whirling tempest. It will burst upon the head of the wicked. In other words, I've given them the leaders to keep them cast in my image, But these are men that are cowards themselves. They're dealing with people that aren't obeying any of his word, and they're saying, hey man, you keep putting money in that plate, you and I are good. You keep putting food in my belly, you do whatever you want. You keep me in the house I live in, you keep my employment secure, and you and I will get along just great. I don't care what you do. You say that's the Old Testament. That's the Old Testament. It's not the New. Consider the words from the New. 2 Timothy 4:3. The time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, healthy teaching, but have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. You see, friends, what are we after here together? Are we after a church in our own image? Let's talk about our marriages. What are we after in our marriages? Are we after a spouse that's in my image? What do I mean by that? Hugely indebted to a guy named Norm Wakefield for waking me up to this truth. My good friend Reed for giving me the message. You all got this message I'm about to share from in the form of a CD. Shame on you if you didn't listen to it. It was my Christmas present to you. What does Norm say? What do we do in our marriage to produce a spouse that's in our own image? We carve. We graven. We manipulate to produce a spouse that looks just like us. How do we do that? Here's what Norm says. Well, we start our manipulation with compliments, with praise, with gifts, with attention. And he says it's not exclusive to one party. We do it to each other. We praise each other. We make the other feel good. Why? So that that other person does what in turn makes us feel good. He said he did a premarital counseling session, and he said to the couple, young couple there, he said to the girl, when you want something, what do you do to get it from him? And she goes, I go like this. And she did like, it doesn't help with a beard, and the baldness. But she made a really cute face, and she smiled, and she shrugged, and she did it. And he said the guy was kind of like, really? Like, I thought you just liked doing that, kind of, like, I didn't know that that was manipulative. And then he asked the guy, and the guy had to think, and he came up with it. And he said, what they found is they were really coming to the other person to have that person shaped into a way that pleased them in the way they wanted to be pleased. He said they broke off the engagement a week later. He said, I couldn't have been more happy. He said that's the point of premarital counseling. To make sure that the love that each other has for one another is God's love and not idolatry. Because idolatry will end in divorce. God's supernatural love won't. He says, because here's the thing. when the compliments and the praise and the gifts and the attention, when the positive manipulative tools wear off, when they don't work as well, we introduce the negative ones. He says, I don't even have to come up with my own list. They're there right in the Bible, Colossians 3:8. Paul says, put away from you anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. When someone stops pleasing us with the syrup, we break out the vinegar. The cold shoulders, the temper tantrums. What is the point? The point is that these are our tools, positive or negative, to form this person in a way that perfectly satisfies me all the time. And when they don't perform, I'll use other methodology to get what I want. I've heard a sick story about the homosexual musician Liberace, who said that he had a young lover and asked his plastic surgeon to perform a surgery on his young lover. And you know what he based that surgery on? A self-portrait. He wanted his lover to look more like him. You're like, oh my goodness, how? That is the worst story I've ever heard. And yet we're all committing it. There may not be homosexuality involved, but we do it in our marriages. We want our spouse to shape-shift to be, the best complement version of myself. And we do it in our marriages. We do it in our church. You do it with your pastors. I do it with you. You do it with your children. You've got a vision, maybe, that your child should fulfill. And maybe there's a lot of good in that vision. But if that vision is your vision, if it feeds you, if it satisfies you, if it nourishes you, that is a God to you. Your child's performance is a God to you, and you will mistreat them if they don't fulfill and satisfy. And that's idolatry. Just listen to this quote by Anne Lamott. You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. You see, friends, churches can very easily become echo chambers. Friendships that last can very easily become echo chambers. You just keep the friends you keep because they like the image you like, whatever that is. This is idolatry. Matt Smethurst said it this way. If God never confuses you, troubles you, or disagrees with you, then you're not staring at transcendence. You're staring at a mirror. Just consider for a moment, I'm just going to rapid pace run through these as it relates to ancient idolatry. It's by commentator Doug Stewart. And he gives one word to summarize these different aspects of ancient idolatry. First, it was guaranteed. There was certainty involved in it. The presence of a god or goddess was guaranteed by an idol who partook of the very essence of that divinity. So you create this idol, and it's supposed to sort of take a portion, a spirit of that God and be present right there with you. And it's very guaranteed, it's certain, versus trusting an unseen God, dealing with that God's silence at times, dealing with waiting on that God. It was very right there, right in front of you, present. We like that. Another aspect of ancient idolatry is that it was selfish, Stewart says. See, the only thing the gods were said not to be able to do in ancient time is feed themselves. So if you were able to bring food to the god, you basically could rest assured that you'd get what you gave back or gave to the god. You scratch his back, he'd scratch yours. So there was a leverage involved, whereas with God, there's no leverage. He is the one who makes straight our paths. We can't fix our paths. Another one was, it was easy, Stewart says. It required sacrifice, but little else. There was a great minimization of any ethical behavior. Whereas with Christianity, Jesus says, he wants to save his life will lose it. You can't follow me unless you take up your cross daily. Another thing is it was convenient. Any time of day, any day of the week, anywhere, because there was altar or religious paraphernalia everywhere, contrasted with a single spot and location that you had to travel long distances to, costly, time-consuming, dangerous. That's what it was like for Israel. It was normal. Canaan attributed all of its wealth and beauty to the gods that they worshipped and the ways that they worshipped them, boiling a kid in its mother's milk, mixing seed, mixing a donkey and an ox to till your soil, the fertility cult. And Israel went in there and they said, well, this is how they got to be this way, so it must be normal. It's very easy for the church to say, look, if a church is run like the professional CEOs and organizations, but Jesus says, no, the servant is the greatest. You serve the poor, not the wealthy. Stewart says it was logical. It made sense in the mind of the ancients that there would be a multiplicity of God, and they specialized in different aspects. It wasn't that way for Israel. God was God of every single territory, not just a national God that helped you in war. Stewart says it was pleasing to the senses. The idols were beautiful, visible, present, versus the invisible God. How do we see this in the States? Well, is there an element of consumerism in the church, like the consumeristic culture around us? Is there an element of entertainment in the church, like the culture of entertainment? He says it was indulgent. When you'd go to the false gods, you'd bring food. The more food you brought, the more they were pleased, which meant the more food you brought, the more you ate, also the more you drank. So there's a pigging out at these worship festivals. It was erotic. The symbolic role of Baal. Men would play that role and sleep with the temple prostitutes, hoping for the gods to commingle in heaven and fertility to happen on the earth. But what all of these things demonstrate, do they not, is that it appeals to us, specifically men. It's sick. It's man-made. It's not God. And that's why God doesn't want any part of it. That's why it's no good for anyone. Friend, I want you to stop. I want us to stop. I want us to consider the practical outworking of the first commandment into the second. Are we seeking an echo chamber? Is that what we have? Is that what we're pursuing? In our most private lives with the people that are closest to us? And as it gets more public with the church, and as it gets more public with the nation, where is the source of it all? Is it with God, or is it with us. You see, it's a fascinating thing. The first commandment, I explained, took us back into the garden where there was a tree of life and tree of knowledge of good and evil. And if you stayed away from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that meant you would let God decide what's good and evil, and you'd look like Him because you're letting Him make the decisions of what's right and wrong, and you'd continue to have access to the tree of life, and therefore live forever because you look like what you were meant to look like. God, He informs what's good in your mind and what's bad in your mind. The second commandment is very equivalent to what happened in the fall. Because when Satan comes to Adam and Eve, he's asking them to erect an idol. And that idol is who? It's what? It's themselves. It's themselves. It's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? What comes first, the idol or the person looking like the idol? It's like a paradox. We want an idol, we make an idol, and then we look like an idol. But if we wanted the idol, didn't we look like the idol before we wanted it? Because the person in the driver's seat of all idolatry is who? Well, it's you. It's me. We are pitting ourselves, just like Satan wanted us to, against God. And we're saying, this is Canaan. This is heaven. This is Eden. It looks just like this. When my wife does this, when my kids do this, when my church does this, when my nation does this, and when all of that is perfect, I'm great. When it's not, I'm a demon. I'm a demon to be around. I'm a demon to live with. And the people closest to me see it first, and the people further out see it later. But eventually, everyone will see it. Because I'm after a kingdom of self. And if you don't march to that beat, we got trouble. Friend, let us, in our repentance, look to Christ, who is our way out of this and our way in to the image that we were meant to be. The purpose of Christ is to be the exact imprint of the Father in order to bring all humanity back into that image. That's the purpose of Christ. That's why He came. That's why we're here, to pursue that image that He came to bring back. And that's what we'll talk about next week. I'll ask you musicians to come.